ഇന്ന് ഞാൻ വന്നിരിക്കുന്നത് 50 MCQs ആണ് ബയോകെമിസ്ട്രിയിൽ. അപ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് ഓരോന്നായി നോക്കാം. The basic building blocks of protein, amino acids. Answer is amino acids. Which of the following is an essential amino acid? That is lysine. The enzyme that converts glucose to glucose 6-phosphate is hexokinase. The enzyme that converts glucose to glucose 6-phosphate is hexokinase. Which vitamin is a cofactor for transaminase enzymes? Vitamin B6. Which vitamin is a cofactor for transaminase enzymes? Vitamin B6. The main storage form of carbohydrate is glycogen. The main storage form of carbohydrate, that is glycogen. Which bond is present between amino acids in protein? That is peptide bond. Which bond is present between amino acid and protein? Answer is peptide bond. The process of converting mRNA into protein is called translation. The process of converting mRNA into protein is called translation. Which is the rate limiting enzyme of glycolysis? That is phosphofructokinase 1. Which is the rate limiting enzyme of glycolysis? Answer is phosphofructokinase 1. The pH at which a molecule carries no net electric charge is called isoelectric point. Answer is isoelectric point. Which lipoprotein has the highest cholesterol content? That is LDL, low density lipoprotein. Which lipoprotein has the highest cholesterol content? That is LDL. Okay. Which mineral is essential for insulin function? That is zinc. Which mineral is essential for insulin function? Answer is zinc. The first step of urea cycle occurs in the mitochondria. Which is not a purine base? That is cytosine. Which is not a purine base? That is cytosine. Sickle cell anemia is caused by substitution of glutamic acid by valine. Sickle cell anemia is caused by substitution of glutamic acid by valine. Which vitamin is essential for collagen synthesis? That is vitamin C. Which is the storage form of iron in the body? That is ferritin. Which is the storage form of iron in the body? Ferritin. Which is the main ketone body in blood during starvation? Beta hydroxybutyrate. Beta hydroxybutyrate. The enzyme inhibited by cyanide is cytochrome oxidase. The enzyme inhibited by cyanide is cytochrome oxidase. Which vitamin deficiency causes pellagra? That is niacin. Which vitamin deficiency causes pellagra? That is niacin. Which amino acid is a precursor for serotonin? That is tryptophan. Which amino acid is a precursor for serotonin? That is tryptophan. Enzyme activity is measured in units. Enzyme activity is measured in units. Which enzyme is elevated in myocardial infarction? That is AST. Which enzyme is elevated in myocardial infarction? That is AST. The enzyme deficient in phenylketonuria is phenylalanine hydroxylase. The enzyme deficient in phenylketonuria is phenylalanine hydroxylase. The energy currency of the cell is ATP. The energy currency of the cell, ATP. Which vitamin act as a coenzyme for carboxylation reaction? That is biotin. Which vitamin acts as a coenzyme for carboxylation reaction? That is biotin. The major plasma protein is albumin. The major plasma protein, albumin. Which pathway produces NADPH? Pentose phosphate pathway. Which pathway produces NADPH? That is pentose phosphate pathway. The genetic material in retroviruses is RNA. The genetic material in retrovirus, that is RNA. The sodium potassium pump is an example of active transport. Sodium potassium pump is an example of active transport. Which amino acid is purely ketogenic? That is lysine and leucine. Both are purely ketogenic. Lysine and leucine are examples of purely ketogenic amino acids. Which vitamin deficiency causes megaloblastic anemia? That is vitamin B12. Which vitamin deficiency causes megaloblastic anemia? That is vitamin B12. The main intracellular buffer is phosphate buffer. The main intracellular buffer is phosphate buffer. Which enzyme is responsible for DNA replication? That is DNA polymerase. Which enzyme is responsible for DNA replication? DNA polymerase. Enzyme inhibition by penicillin is irreversible. Enzyme inhibition by penicillin is irreversible. Which is the first enzyme in the heme biosynthesis pathway? That is ALA synthase. Which is the first enzyme in the heme biosynthetic pathway? That is ALA synthase. Which lipoprotein is called good cholesterol? That is HDL, high density lipoprotein. Which lipoprotein is called good cholesterol? That is HDL, high density lipoprotein. Which amino acid is a precursor for histamine? That is histidine. Which amino acid is a precursor for histamine? That is histidine. Glucagon is secreted by alpha cells of pancreas. Glucagon is secreted by alpha cells of pancreas. Which mineral is a cofactor for carbonic anhydrase? That is zinc. Which mineral is a cofactor for carbonic anhydrase? Answer is zinc. The end product of purine metabolism is uric acid. The end product of purine metabolism, uric acid. Which vitamin is involved in vision? That is vitamin A. Which vitamin is involved in vision? That is vitamin A. The main site of gluconeogenesis is liver. The main site of gluconeogenesis, that is liver. Which enzyme digests starch? Amylase. Which enzyme digests starch? Amylase. Which amino acid has a sulfur atom? That is methionine. Which amino acid has a sulfur atom? That is methionine. The main reducing sugar in blood is glucose. The main reducing sugar in blood, that is glucose. Which vitamin acts as an antioxidant? That is vitamin E. Which vitamin acts as an antioxidant? That is vitamin E. Which process occurs in mitochondrial matrix? That is TCA cycle. Which process occurs in the mitochondrial matrix? That is TCA cycle. Which enzyme convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2? That is ACE. Which enzyme convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2? That is ACE. Which amino acid is a precursor for melanin? That is tyrosine. Which amino acid is a precursor for melanin? Tyrosine. Which form of hemoglobin is found in the fetus? That is hemoglobin F. വിച്ച് ഫോം ഓഫ് ഹീമോഗ്ലോബിൻ ഇസ് ഫൗണ്ട് ഇൻ ഫീറ്റസ്? ഹീമോഗ്ലോബിൻ F. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മളിന്ന് 50 MCQs പറഞ്ഞു ബയോകെമിസ്ട്രിയിൽ. ഇനി വേറെ ഏതെങ്കിലും സബ്ജക്റ്റിൽ വേണമെങ്കിൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വേറെ ഏതെങ്കിലും ടോപ്പിക് വേണമെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് പറയാവുന്നതാണ്. പിന്നെ വീഡിയോ ഇഷ്ടപ്പെട്ടാൽ ലൈക്ക് ചെയ്യുക, ഷെയർ ചെയ്യുക, കമൻറ്റ് ചെയ്യുക. ഓൾസോ സബ്സ്ക്രൈബ് മൈ ചാനൽ. താങ്ക്സ് ഫോർ വാച്ചിങ്.